Welcome. This is the last lecture for Unit 8. This is the Art Impulse lecture for Unit 8 for the Art History course. And the Art Impulse today is Tell It Like It Is, which is essentially the documentary impulse, the desire of artists to see the world, to look at it clearly, and then be able to tell other people, like, this is how the world is, don't you see it this way? And we're talking about this primarily because we were talking about photography earlier on in this unit. And photography definitely, documentation and documentary photography is a major part of the history of photography, so it was a logical time to be talking about these issues. Hopefully, there's about 15 slides. I think I might be able to go through all of these quickly enough to do it in one 10-minute lecture, so we shall see. So one of the things is that artists, like when we talked about the study impulse, we've already kind of clarified that artists, as part of their job, are always looking. They're looking at things, they're looking at people. And one of the things sometimes that happens is that artists are also using very ordinary people as models, sometimes because that's the only people they can afford, or sometimes, like in the case of Courbet, because of social issues, like that they want to specifically have working class people be the people in their paintings. But either way, it can be a political issue. Caravaggio was a controversial part of his artwork, that all of his models were very working class or poor people. And so being interested in people leads to being interested in how people actually work in this world and how they function physically, biologically. But also leads to being interested in how people make a living, what people do for work, and the difference between being working class versus being upper class. And that also then leads to noticing things like children working in mines at the age of 6, or being aware of the conditions of, the hours that people work. This painting by Manet has, to me, very much a sympathy for the young working person. She is exhausted. But one of the things that always makes me happy about this painting is that it does have my favorite beer. So that kind of paying attention to the world, paying attention to people, can also then lead to being more socially conscious. So that can lead to artists wanting to document what really happens, like the injustices of the world, the tragic disasters, and war. And of course, it wasn't until photography that artists really could document war in the moment. In the American Civil War, this is from the Spanish Civil War, in the American Civil War there were illustrators hired who, as well as photographers, but it was a very hard job to be an illustrator in wartime. But wartime documentary photography is definitely a way that makes it possible to tell other people what's going on. I want you to just look at these two pictures for a moment. And I've always liked the kind of the similarities between the two, and just think about how artists decide what they want to document. So facing the truth, documenting things, or facing reality can mean facing things like historical truths, facing the fact that your government is responsible for the killing of political protesters, or facing the truth that your country under previous governments was responsible for genocide. So here are two images. So well, like I say in the notes, that this kind of when artists become more and more focused on looking at reality and facing things the way they are, then there's more and more likelihood that artists are also going to be looking and looking at things that other people want to look away from, like the downtrodden, like the insane. But there are many artists who are very much interested in looking at reality, looking at the world, but are not interested in any kind of social or political content. So it's not that everybody who tries to document the world the way the world is making a political statement. Here we have another Manet, and we also have a Fantin Latour. Or in the case that artists sometimes are interested in the documentation of reality, is also a thing about, it's also about documenting how we see reality. And both these cases, these are paintings that are more about how we perceive things than about the reality of the thing we're perceiving. So looking at the landscape, lots of artists have tried to look at the landscape as objectively as possible. What's interesting is how different sometimes artists can see that. But Manet, probably more than anyone, pushed himself to really to see, in this case, especially the color of what was going, the color that he actually saw, the color of real perception, rather than the color of local color, the color of our mental idea of things. He tried to see color, the truth of it, as clearly as possible. So my last two slides on this lecture are Giacometti, and then the next slide I think is Frank Auerbach, and they're both artists who are very obsessive about really getting to see what's in front of them as clearly as possible. What's interesting to me is that a lot of artists, or a lot of students and art students, often don't believe that. They look at these paintings and they think these paintings are all about style, but they're not really much about style. They're really about the pursuit, the attempt, right? The way they look is a reflection of the repeated attempts at drawing and redrawing, correcting and recorrecting, changing and changing over and over again. And it gives them that kind of jittery, angular kind of quality. But for Giacometti, that is not the effect is not the reason for working this way. The reason for working this way is to see more clearly. And I think you can say the same for Frank Auerbach. Although he works quite differently and thinks much more about big marks and gestures and shapes, these are paintings that are about pushing himself to perceive, even if the way that perception is recorded is hard to understand to other people. That's, for him, what matters is the effort towards seeing. Okay, I think that is the end of the lecture. All right, that is the end of Unit 8.